Okay. So, hi everybody. Welcome to our Palestine Mondays event with our honorable guest, Dr. Rashid Khalidi. We are super excited to be hosting him today. I hope all of you and your families and your loved ones are doing well and staying safe and healthy during these times. So we're very excited to have you all join us today. We want to let you know that we have several series that are going out throughout the week. Today is Palestine Mondays, and as I said, we have Dr. Khalidi joining us today, and actually next week we also have Dr. Noura Arikat joining us, and that event will start at 5:30 p.m. In addition to that, we have several events in different series. So we have How To Tuesdays, Workshop Wednesdays, Game Night Thursdays, Community Check-in Fridays, Serene Saturday, and Reading Challenge Sundays. We also have different programs that we've transitioned to online, including Toddler Time, English Conversation, and homework help programs that are happening all online. And we highly encourage you all to check them out at our website, www.paccusa.org, for an update about all of our events and programs. You can also follow us on social media at PACUSA, and you can follow us on TikTok, on Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat, and we kind of post on all of those platforms. So before we formally begin the event, at PAC, we're dedicated to make sure that we all count and that everybody takes the census. So we're gonna be showing a 3-minute video about the census. And then after that, we have a short survey for you to take, and you can get entered to win a prize for the raffle. So I'll be sharing my screen right now. Just one moment. There we go, share.
Bingo.
Perfect. Okay.
Thanks for tuning in to PAC's Sensational Communities presentation. Today we'll be talking about the importance of the census, and if you stick around until the end, you'll be eligible to win an Amazon gift card. Stay tuned. So what is the census? The census is a decennial survey that is conducted by the government to generate demographic information and to determine where billions of dollars of federal funding are allocated. The census is for everyone, regardless of legal status. We all count. You might be wondering how the census benefits you. Census funding is used to ensure that money is sent to programs like Medicare, WIC, food stamps, workforce development, and more. Everything from your town's roads to your town's public schools and after-school programs are funded by the census. Furthermore, the census determines political representation. The census determines how many representatives we get in Congress, and for the first time in history, the census allows participants to write in their race and ethnicity. This is wonderful news for Arab Americans, as we can write in what we identify as, and hopefully evoke change in leadership. We need to show the U.S. that Arab Americans count too. We matter. The census is completely safe. Your information is protected by Title 13 of the U.S. Code. Even the President of the United States cannot access your information. Census can only be used to derive demographic data. Any violation of this will result in 5 years of jail or a $250,000 fine. Attorneys across the country are enforcing these rules and protecting your information. The census is also super easy to fill out. For the first time ever, it's available online and over the phone. It's even available in Arabic. Of course, you can still fill out the paper form if one was mailed to you. Didn't get anything in the mail? No problem. You can still head over to 2020census.gov to complete your census right now. And if you have any questions, you can always contact PAC. The census is super important, it's safe, and it's easy, but you must look out for scams. The Census Bureau will never ask you for any credit card information, debit card information, bank account information, or your social security number, and the Census Bureau will never call you at your house. Any questions? You can always contact Dala Ismail at tismail@pacusa.org or text the PAC Census Hotline from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. daily at 973-963-7267. Thanks so much. Be sure to fill out the survey at the end of this to be entered into the raffle for the Amazon gift card. Make sure to fill out your 2020 census. We count.
So I hope everybody took a message from that, is that we count. I'll be adding the link to the survey at the right after I finish introducing Dr. Khalidi. So just so everybody is familiar with the format. So we're going to be starting with listening to Dr. Khalidi, who will be giving us a presentation and having a lecture. And then after that, we're going to go into questions and answers. We ask that you put them in the chat, or if you can raise your hand, and then we're going to go around and pick different people to speak. Please make sure to mute your mics at all times if you're not speaking, and show your screens. We'd love to see you guys. Dr. Khalidi is a professor, and so he's used to teaching in classes, and so we would love to see you all if that is possible. So if you can turn on your screen, your video, that would be great. If you don't know how, you just go towards the bottom. There's a stop video. If you just click on it, oh, beautiful. I'm seeing everyone's faces. So I think you guys figured it out. Click on that.
They're listening to you.
Yes, thank you all. So in regards to just some different functions so everybody knows, so you can, the chat function is also on the bottom. So if you click on it, the chat will pop up. You can ask any questions there. If you want to message me privately, you can just go to my name and then you can message me there as well. If you would like to say anything else on the participants button, there is an option to raise your hand and you can raise your hand there. So without further ado, the man of the hour, I will be making his introduction and then I'll be passing on the mic to him. So Dr. Rashid Khalidi is the author of Palestinian Identity, Brokers of Deceit, and The Iron Cage, among others. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and many other journals. He is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University in New York and editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. He is here today to discuss his newest book, The 100 Years War on Palestine. You can buy his book at www.bookshop.org. I'll be putting the link in the chat. And so without further ado, Dr. Khalidi, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rania. Thanks to the people at the Palestinian American Community Center for doing this. You guys are ahead of everybody. This is the first online book talk I've done. I was in the middle of a book tour when this horrible virus struck. In fact, I had just given a talk in Providence, Rhode Island, and nobody's gotten their act together as fast as you guys did. So props to you guys. Thanks everybody for joining in. I've actually never done a lecture this big before. I teach, we've moved over to teaching online the last couple of weeks, but I've never had, how many people now? 54 people listening online. So it's a new experience for me, and I'm not yet a veteran of online teaching. I've been teaching for more than 40 years, but never taught this many people online. The title and the subtitle of my book give a good sense of its main arguments. The title is The 100 Years War on Palestine. The subtitle is A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. And I think it's important to mention that I didn't write this book for academics. I didn't write it for experts. I wrote it for the general reader, and I wrote it especially for the American general reader. So those of you who are Palestinian American, or those of you who've lived in the Middle East may know some of the stuff in this book. It wasn't entirely intended for you all, but I hope you all will benefit from it. And I meant it for a general reader because I kept being told by people like my son, Ismail, by people like some of my relatives and friends, enough already writing for academics, enough monographs and books that are intended mainly for other experts. It's time to try and reach a more general audience. And so that's what I tried to do with this book. Any of you who have paid attention to the way the media frames the conflict in Palestine will know that it's usually misframed. It's often portrayed as a tragic struggle between two national movements over the same land, or it's falsely portrayed as an attempt by the Arabs, who are often seen as anti-Semitic, to foil the just struggle of the Jewish people to establish a state in their ancestral homeland. What I am arguing in this book is that these interpretations are largely false. And I put forward a counter-argument. I argue in the book that what has happened in Palestine over more than a century now has to be understood as a war waged on the Palestinian people which is to say on the country's indigenous population, in order to establish a settler colonial project in their midst, and in order ultimately to replace them. Another argument I make in this book is that this was not just a war waged by the Zionist movement or the state of Israel, but a war actually waged by and declared by different great powers. This starts with Britain in the period up to 1947, 48. It continues with the United States and the Soviet Union in 1947, 1948. Later on, Britain and France come back, and then later on, starting in the 60s, it's largely the United States. And the argument that this book makes is that these powers didn't only endorse or support this war, sometimes they were actually actively engaged in waging war on the Palestinians. I argue that's the case with almost every one of them, certainly Britain, also later on Britain and France, and certainly also, I argue, the United States. What this means is that it wasn't just a battle between Zionists and Palestinians or Arabs and Israelis. It was a battle primarily between the Palestinians, with very little support, Israel, and major powers supporting it, and many times actually fighting alongside it. So that's one of the unusual features of this war. Another peculiar aspect of this war was that the colonizers didn't come from a colonial metropole. In other words, they weren't French people coming from France, as in Algeria, or British people coming to Kenya from Britain, or coming to North America, for that matter, from Britain. Instead, what was going on was the Zionist movement was drawing its settlers mainly from the persecuted Jewish population of Eastern and Central Europe. Also, unlike most other colonial projects, the Zionist movement sought to establish its own exclusive, independent, sovereign Jewish state. And if you think about other colonial settler movements, in this, it was unlike them. For example, French and British settlers in, say, Algeria or, say, Kenya wanted to remain linked to the mother country. The French in Algeria thought of themselves as part of France. They said Algeria is part of France. In other words, at the same time as Zionism was a self-described settler colonial project, it was also a nascent national movement in the modern sense, seeking to establish an independent Jewish state in Palestine. We also know another unique factor about it, when you compare it with other colonial settler movements, was that there was an ancient biblical connection between the Jewish religion and between Palestine, which meant that Zionism could claim to be reviving Jewish sovereignty in Palestine, rather than establishing an entirely new entity. And as you know, this claim had great resonance, not only with Jews, but also with Christians in the United States and Britain in particular. So the argument of the book is that this is a settler colonial project, but that Palestine was a unique case of settler colonialism. The colonial settler movement, which aimed to found a new national entity in Palestine, was in some sense independent of its great power patrons. At the same time as it needed them and relied on them, it was also independent of them. And this was a great strength of the Zionist movement, and it made it completely different from other settler colonial projects. So I'm arguing it's a settler colonial project, but it's a different one than all the others. One way in which it was different was that it had independent financial means. If you think of the Algerian case, the French settlers in Algeria were completely dependent on the metropole. British settlers in South Africa or East Africa or North America were completely dependent on the British crown, on the British state. That's not entirely true of the Zionist movement. However much they relied on Britain at the outset and other powers later on, they had their own independent financial means. An Israeli scholar has shown that the capital inflows to the Yishuv, to the Jewish community in Palestine, in the 1920s amounted to over 140% of the gross domestic product of the separate Jewish economy of Palestine. In other words, they were getting almost 1.5 times what they were producing in capital annually, every single year during the 1920s. And that wasn't money coming from Britain. That was money that the Zionist movement itself collected. Indeed, we're talking about a movement that has always been dependent, not just on its great power patrons, but on this independent financial base that it has been cultivating for over 100 years. Nevertheless, from the time of Herzl until the 1940s, the Zionist movement openly described itself as colonial in nature. This is not, in other words, a slander against Zionism. This is not just some nasty way of describing Zionism. This is the way the Zionist movement described itself. This is how Herzl wrote about it. This is how Zev Jabotinsky wrote about it. This is how David Ben-Gurion wrote about it in his diaries. One of the key institutions that helped to establish many of the colonies that were set up in Palestine in the late 19th century, first part of the 20th century, was the Jewish Colonization Agency, JCA. They saw themselves as both, native to the country, it's their country, but they also saw themselves as European colonists. It was only after World War II that this self-description of Zionism as a colonial movement changed. This happened when colonialism went out of fashion in the global era of decolonization after World War II, and after the conflict after the outbreak of a conflict between the Zionist movement and the British. Now, one way in which this is a different book than anything I've ever written, and a different book, I hope, than most of the histories of Palestine, is that it includes many stories, many individual stories by participants in the events, including members of my own family. I began the book with an account of a letter that my great uncle wrote to Theodore Herzl back in the 1890s, and that's the first section of the book, and it continues in different chapters with either accounts of people who were involved, or in some cases accounts of things that I myself witnessed or was told about or participated in. So it's a very different kind of book than anything I ever wrote. It was much harder for me to write than the standard histories that I've written about Palestine and Arab nationalism and American policy in the past. So I opened the book with this incident that occurred in 1899, when this great uncle, whose name was Yusuf Khalidi, and who had served as a deputy in the Ottoman Parliament and was also mayor of Jerusalem for a number of times, wrote a letter to Theodore Herzl. And it's a very interesting letter. It's 6 pages long. It's in his own handwriting. It's in French. He wrote it from Istanbul, where he was in exile at the time. Sultan Abdul Hamid made him stay in Istanbul. He didn't trust him. And he wrote Herzl and said that he had great sympathy for the Jewish people. He understood the persecution and the anti-Semitism that they were subjected to. But he warned Herzl against implementation of the Zionist program for a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, Yusuf Khalidi knew German. He had lived in Vienna. He'd been a diplomat in the Ottoman Foreign Service. He lived all over Europe. He knew what Zionism involved. He'd read in the Austrian press, he'd read in other places what the Zionist movement projected. And so he warned Herzl, and he told him that Palestine was already inhabited. He told him that the population of Palestine would never agree to be superseded, and that therefore the whole Zionist program was unrealistic and dangerous. And he concluded his letter to Herzl with the words, "For the sake of God, leave Palestine alone." Herzl responded to him, but of course he ignored this appeal. So that's how the book begins. I'm not going to go in detail through the book chapter by chapter. I'm just going to describe what the chapters of the book are, and I'll say a little bit about a couple of them. The first chapter starts with the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations mandate in 1917 and 1922. The second chapter talks about the partition resolution of 1947 and the Nakba in Palestine that followed. The third chapter talks about the 1967 war, and in particular about the resolution that resulted from that war, UN Security Council Resolution 242. The fourth chapter is about the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the siege of Beirut, the expulsion of the PLO from Beirut, and the massacres that took place in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps at the end of the war. Fifth chapter is about the Oslo Accords, and the last chapter is about the wars on Gaza. And I describe each of these 6 chapters in terms of new declarations of war on the Palestinian people. So this is 100 years war in the way I'm telling it, which had multiple declarations of war on the Palestinians. And so I describe each of these cases as a new international document that consisted of a declaration of war on the Palestinian people. So I say the Balfour Declaration, for example, was not just some statement by the British government. In effect, it was a declaration of war on the Palestinians. Why? Because the Balfour Declaration said that the Jewish people had political rights and national rights in Palestine. It never mentioned the Palestinian Arabs, who were 94% of the population. They were described only as non-Jews, and they were described as having only civil and religious rights. This, I argue, together with the Mandate for Palestine, which came a couple of years later, and which included the Balfour Declaration. This, I argue, is a declaration of war on the Palestinians. When you say, this is your country, but you don't exist, you're never mentioned. This people has national rights here. This people has political rights here, and all you are entitled to are civil and religious rights. This is in effect a declaration of war. It's a statement, we are going to give this country to another people who are named in this document. And I think if you look at the Trump plan that was issued a little more than a year ago, you'll see that it's a similar declaration of war on the Palestinian people. I'll get to that later. So by issuing this declaration of war, what the British were saying is, this is what we intend to do. We intend to impose a mainly European settler population with its own exclusive national objectives on the indigenous population. And what the British aimed to do was to hold down the Palestinians until the Jewish population of Palestine became a majority, and it could then exercise self-determination. And the British never actually explicitly said this was their aim, but they said it privately to people like Chaim Weizmann, who became the leader of the Zionist movement after Herzl. The British managed to do this, managed to hold the Palestinians down while the Jewish population was increasing and Jewish land purchase was increasing, until a great revolt broke out in 1936, and it continued for over 3 years. Finally, the Palestinians realized what was happening. They rose up against the British occupiers, and for a little while, they were successful. They took over several major cities. They drove the British out of the countryside. Ultimately, the British then launched a massive repressive campaign. They brought in 2 divisions of the British Army. They brought in the Royal Air Force. They ended up having over 100,000 troops in Palestine, which amounted to 1 soldier to every 3 adult male Palestinians. The repression was devastating. It killed, wounded, led to the capture or the exile of about 10% of the adult male population of Palestine. So about 10% of the adult males in Palestine were killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled as a result of this repressive campaign, which really broke the back of the Palestinian people between 1936 and 39. So I'm arguing the Balfour Declaration was a declaration of war, and that the British actually carried out a war on the Palestinians a number of years later in their repression of the 1936-39 revolt. The second declaration of war on the Palestinians was also an international document. It was General Assembly Resolution 181 of 1947, which was basically forced through the General Assembly by the combined efforts of the United States and the Soviet Union. What did this resolution do? What did this declaration of war do? It gave more than half of Palestine, inhabited at that point by a 2/3 Arab majority, to the 1/3 Jewish minority. Most of the country was being given by the partition resolution forced through by the Americans and the Soviets to a Jewish minority, which at that point owned less than 7% of the land of Palestine. We know about what happened. A war followed. And before the British left in May 1948, before the Arab armies entered Palestine in the same month, over 300,000 Palestinians had already been driven out of Jaffa, out of Haifa, out of West Jerusalem, out of Bisan, out of Tiberias. Another 450,000 were driven out during the war with the Arab countries that followed, for a total of 750,000 Palestinian refugees created by this campaign of ethnic cleansing during this war. By the end of the war, the Israeli army, which was armed and supported by both the United States and the Soviet Union, ended up conquering about almost 80%, 78% of the entire country. So I'm arguing that the partition resolution was a declaration of war by the great powers, the new superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, on the Palestinians. I'm going to talk about the third one, and then I'll skip to my conclusion. The third declaration of war on the Palestinians came in 1967, after the June War that Israel launched in collusion with the United States. We now have documents showing that before Israel went to war, it sent the head of the Mossad to Washington, and he got the approval of Secretary of Defense McNamara and President Johnson to launch a preemptive attack on the Arab countries. The war produced a document that established the international parameters for dealing with Palestine, and they have been there ever since. That's UN Security Council Resolution 242 of November 22nd, 1967. Once again, in this text, the Palestinian people were not even mentioned by name, as in the Balfour Declaration in 1917. The text didn't, instead, 242 merely speaks about, quote, a just resolution of the refugee problem. The text doesn't even mention which refugee problem it was referring to. The word Palestine and Palestinians doesn't exist in 242, just as it doesn't exist in the Balfour Declaration at all. As in that document, the Palestinians were simply erased, as if they didn't exist as a political or a national entity. And this has become the basis of the management of the conflict for the past half century. Let me skip to the fourth declaration of war on the Palestinians, which took place in 1982. Just as with the 67 war, before Israel went to war, it made sure to get a green light from the United States. So Israeli Minister of Defense Ariel Sharon goes to Washington in May 1982. He meets with Secretary of State Haig. He tells him what he's planning to do, and he gets a green light from Washington. So this is another case where it's not just Israel going to war, it's Israel going to war with the permission of the United States, which is why I describe what's happening here as a declaration of war on the Palestinians, not just by Israel, but also by the United States. In this chapter of my book, I rely, as in the 1967 chapter, I rely not only on documents and memoirs. There are 45 pages of footnotes in this book, so there's all the documentation you could possibly want if you're a student. But the bulk of the 82 chapter and some of the 1967 chapter also includes my own personal recollections. My father worked for the United Nations in the Security Council in 1967, and I describe what I saw during the June War as a college student in the visitors gallery of the Security Council. That's how I start my description of the 1967 chapter. And I was in Beirut in 1982. I and my wife and our kids and my brother and my mother, my whole family were in Beirut during the 82 war, as was at least one of the participants. I think, Hassan, you were there too. I saw you somewhere. Yeah, there you are. As maybe were some of you. And I use my own experiences and use my own recollections to describe what happened. But it's not a personal account. It's not an autobiography. I also go into, in great detail, into American responsibility, not just for the war, which I lay out in detail, how the United States supported Israel in launching the war and gave it a green light. I also talk about US responsibility for the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, because the United States officially guaranteed to the PLO, as a condition of its leaving Beirut, that the United States would ensure the safety of the civilian population of the refugee camps who were left behind. And of course, that guarantee was never faithfully honored. I also cite documents that have never before been published from the secret annexes to the Israeli Commission of Inquiry into these massacres, the so-called Kahan Commission, which is headed by a Supreme Court justice, an Israeli Supreme Court justice. And these documents reveal the complicity of the United States and of the Lebanese forces in the massacres. I'm not going to talk anymore about the other two chapters of the book, the Oslo chapter or the Gaza War chapter. Let me just conclude by and that the last chapter on Gaza also includes my discussion of the Trump plan, even though the book was published in January, on January 28th, the day that Trump actually announced his plan. And it was completed months before, but I could see what was coming, and so there is a description in the book of what the United States is up to. And I argue that this is a new declaration of war on the Palestinians, in spite of the gloomy situation created by this administration. I argue in the conclusion to the book that there are a number of reasons for optimism about the future. I'm just going to mention them, and then we can go to a discussion. The first reason for optimism is what I've witnessed on American college campuses in the last few years. I was a college student in the United States in the 1960s, and I remember how hostile the atmosphere was. You couldn't even mention the word Palestine. It was a taboo to talk about Palestine back in the 60s. That's not the case on American college campuses today. Even though there's resistance, there is a robust movement in support of Palestinian rights on many, many college campuses. And in some cases, it's more robust than the organizations that are supportive of Israel. On my campus at Columbia and on many other campuses, you have divestment resolutions being passed by student bodies. Barnard College at Columbia passed one. Brown University passed one. On other campuses, there's an open debate about Palestine, something that was inconceivable 20 or 30 years ago. And so what is happening on college campuses, I find, is a cause of optimism, because these are places where you have people who are actually able to access much more information than people were a generation or two generations ago. And that is leading to a level, not just of activism, but of information about Palestine that simply was inaccessible even 10 or 15 years ago. So that's one reason that I'm optimistic. Another reason I'm optimistic is that this false narrative about Palestine that Israeli propaganda has successfully created over many decades is no longer viable in academia. You can't make many of the completely false arguments about Palestine that Zionists have made for decades and decades and decades and get a respectful hearing in many, many areas of American academia, especially areas like the social sciences and the humanities. These are fields where, in anthropology or history, an entirely new a narrative has been established, one that respects much of what Palestinians know was always the case about, for example, the creation of the refugees by Israel as a result of the creation of the state of Israel, about the imbalance between the two sides, about the fact that really the powerful actor has always been Israel and its international supporters, that the Palestinians obviously are in a much weaker situation. And many, many other false narratives are completely discredited in academia in the United States. And a more objective and more balanced understanding of what is happening and what has happened is available through academia. I almost can't follow the number of books that I receive every day almost on Palestine. Really good stuff is being published in many, many fields of academia. I'll give you one more piece of evidence of this. Annually, over 200,000 full articles are downloaded via JSTOR or other platforms from the Journal of Palestine Studies. 200,000 articles a year are downloaded from the Journal of Palestine Studies. Most of this is being done by students, academics, policymakers, journalists, and it's an indication that good information is available and is being used by people all over the country and, in fact, all over the world. So that's a second reason that I'm optimistic. A third reason that I'm optimistic is what is happening at the base of the Democratic Party. If you want to be pessimistic, you need only look at this administration or the Republican Party, where support for Israel is at an all-time high. But if you want to be optimistic, you need only look at the base of the Democratic Party. The real constituents of the Democratic Party, minorities, liberals, urban populations, are increasingly shifting away from unconditional support for Israel and are more and more supporting Palestinian rights. You can see resolutions being put before Congress, only by a group of congressmen and women and senators, but this is something that was inconceivable 20 years ago. You never had a resolution put before Congress saying Israel should stop detaining Palestinian children or Israel should stop some of what it's doing in Gaza. And this is a result of pressure from the base on the leadership of the Democratic Party. And it's much more intense at the base, obviously. So even though many leading figures in the party, including, for that matter, Vice President Biden, are still very pro-Israeli, the base is becoming increasingly open-minded, increasingly resistant to Israeli propaganda, and increasingly willing to push the leadership on this issue. And I think this is very, very important. And over time, these are the people who are going to become the majority in this country. Already, the Democrats got 10 million more votes than the Republicans during the 2018 mid-year elections. Think about that. The Democratic Party is a majority in this country. Even with a very unpopular candidate in 2016, the Democrats got 3 million more votes than the Republicans. The base of the majority party in the United States is becoming increasingly pro-Palestinian. Sooner or later, in spite of all of the disabilities that the Constitution imposes, that the electoral system imposes, that the Electoral College imposes, those numbers will tell. And I think that's a very important reason for optimism. The fourth reason has to do with changes inside the Jewish community. If you look especially at younger segments of the Jewish community, you'll see a remarkable transformation taking place. Many, many more younger people in the Jewish community are more and more critical of the falsehoods and the mythical narratives that they've always been told, are becoming more and more open-minded towards the Palestinian narrative, and are being more and more willing to stand up to the leadership of the community, which is still obviously completely in the grip of a very pro-Israel narrative. That hasn't changed, but younger people are changing. So the older folks, they're where they used to be, but younger people in the Jewish community, and you see this on campus, you see this at the base of the Democratic Party, you can see it in you can see it in the divisions within many synagogues and within many families within the Jewish community. Finally, another reason for optimism is that Arab Americans and Muslim Americans are becoming more active politically. More of them are running for office, more of them are donating to political campaigns, more of them are involved in legal efforts to defend Palestinian rights and freedom of speech. Things like Palestine Legal are getting increasing support, not just from the Palestinian community or Palestinian Americans or Muslim Americans, but from ordinary Americans as well. And people are reaching out. People are understanding that you don't do this just through organizing Muslim Americans or Arab Americans or Palestinian Americans. You do it through intersectionality. You do it by figuring out where there are links to people like African Americans, who see that the policing of American cities is now being done in some cases on the basis of models which they're importing from the Israeli occupation, because police departments are sending people over to Palestine to learn from the Israelis how to hold down an occupied population. Well, African Americans can understand that. They can understand Palestine through their own experience. And that's true, for example, of Puerto Ricans who understand colonialism from their own experiences in Puerto Rico, and so on and so forth. So those, I think, are all reasons for optimism. Obviously, the support that the United States gives to Israel is at a greater level than it's ever been before. That's not going to change until this administration changes. It might not change even with a Democratic administration, because the leadership of the Democratic Party is still very, very, very wedded to the old narrative. But I think things are changing. I think that there are many, many reasons for optimism. I think that a book like mine couldn't have been published 20 years ago. It was published by a mainstream trade publisher. I hope it does well. I hope a lot of people get a chance to read it. I hope if you have a chance to buy it and enjoy it, you tell other people about it. It's very hard to publicize a book in the era of COVID-19. So any help you can give, I would appreciate. And I think it helps to change the narrative. And that's what we have to do. We have to change the narrative. And I have to say, I was born in this country. I grew up in this country. I'd lived half my life outside of the United States, but I spent almost more than half actually living in the United States. Things have changed enormously for the better in terms of that narrative, in terms of how people understand Palestine. It's a situation that has to change a lot more before there's political change or before there's change in the media. But I really do think that there are opportunities now that never existed before. I am very optimistic, in spite of the description that I've given, in spite of the terrible situation in Palestine, which I haven't talked about. There's a little bit about that in the book. In spite of that, I am ultimately optimistic. So let me stop there and see if you guys have any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalidi. That was very, very enlightening. And I think, as Executive Director of the Palestinian American Community Center, we have to be optimistic. And, it's each of our responsibility to make sure that the narrative continues and that each of us take this as a personal responsibility to make sure that one day we will see a free Palestine. So with that, inshallah. So with that, I want to ask everybody to put their questions into the chat. We've received a few, so I'm going to go through them. Like I said in the chat, we're going to be going through them depending on how they come in. So the first question we got was from Yusuf, who asked, what was Herzl's reply to Khalidi, to you? What did he refer to, or to Khalidi, what did he refer to the Palestinian people as?
Okay, I'm looking at the the questions, but I'm not going to look at them in print. I'll just answer them as you ask me, as you ask them to me. Herzl's reply was very courteous but dismissive. He did not respond to one of the points that Yusuf Khalidi made in his letter. Instead, he tried to reassure him by saying, oh, the Zionist movement will improve the prosperity of everybody. He acted basically as if Yusuf was not very smart and didn't understand that Zionism was not about giving prosperity to everybody. It was about creating a Jewish state in a country that had an Arab population, which ultimately meant replacing that population. In fact, we know from Herzl's diaries that he was already thinking about that. There's a passage in his diaries where he talks about spiriting the population across the frontier. So they were already thinking, or he was already thinking, of getting rid of them. And he actually mentions a consideration that Yusuf Khalidi never mentioned himself in his original letter by saying something like, why would we think of getting rid of these people? Well, Yusuf didn't ask about expulsion of the Palestinians. But in a sense, Herzl had a guilty conscience already. He realized that this was what was involved. And so basically he was being deceptive in his response.
Thank you very much. So the next question is from Najah, who asked, how does the US benefit from Israel's attack on the Arab countries?
Well, there are different ways that the United States benefited or has benefited. The first is that, especially during the Cold War, the United States saw Israel as an ally against countries that were allied to the Soviet Union. And so from the time that the American-Israeli relationship really became very close in the early 1960s, the United States perceived Israel as a vital ally, helping it to fight countries like Egypt under Abdel Nasser, or Syria under the Ba'ath at the time, or other Arab countries that were seen as radical, pro-Soviet, aligned, socialist, aligned, in other words, with the United States as Cold War rival. Over time, that's changed. Over time, that relationship has been sold to the United States in terms of a global war on terror. By the time the Cold War ended in 1989, 1990, the old argument, oh, we need an ally against the Soviets, no longer held water. And so Israel began to market itself to the United States as an ally on what it described as a uniform, consistent terrorist offensive, lumping together things like Al-Qaeda, later on Daesh, the Islamic State, Hamas, Hezbollah, everything into one basket, and saying the United States needs Israel to help it to fight this global war on terror. And after 9/11, that became the basis of it. Now, is that legitimate, or does it actually expose the United States to more harm? That's an argument that people don't want to hear in Washington, and it's probably true. But that's the basis that's one of the main bases for the United States relying on Israel.
Thank you very much. So Lulu asked, can you please suggest some books adding positive light in Palestine and enriching academia?
I mean, obviously, I would suggest books that I've written. You can Google them. There are a number of them. Another wonderful book is The Question of Palestine by Edward Said. What I would suggest, if you want a list, I mean, I can send you a multi-page bibliography. Just email me, and I can send you a very long bibliography on Palestine, or I can suggest a couple of books. It depends on what you're interested in. There's really a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful array of books on almost any aspect of history, politics, society, gender, you name it, in Palestine today. And I'd be happy to provide, individually to people a list of sources.
I'm going to echo Lulu's question. I'd love that list as well. We can share it with our, participants.
What I can do is I can send you, Rania, this very long bibliography, and you can post it on the Palestinian American Community Center's site.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
No problem. Remind me, though.
I will. I'll send you an email.
Please.
So Tala said, Dr. Khalidi, you have done an incredible job in making the Palestinian narrative more accessible to even non-Arabs. Do you have advice for us when it comes to trying to frame the story of Palestine to the average American in such a way that they would be willing to listen?
That's a very good question, Tala. I think the key thing is to be knowledgeable about the facts, to read a little bit of the history, because there's a set number of arguments. I've been listening to them since I was a teenager in the United States. They always say the same thing. And if you actually know a little bit of the history, you can easily tear those arguments apart. If you don't, it's just a matter of emotion against emotion, and there's no way that you can prevail. So I think the key thing is to learn as much as you can about the history and the facts of what actually happened in Palestine, so that you can deal with these myths that have been so pervasive in American in the American media and in American public life.
So someone asks, when arguing with the opposite side of the issue, I'm always faced with the comment, quote, Palestine as a country never existed in the first place. It has always been under some sort of rule, unquote. What would be a good answer to?
Yeah, the last thing you said, what would be a good answer to that? Is that what you said, Rania? There was interference there. You're frozen.
Sorry, yeah, so the question is, am I still frozen?
No, you're good. You're good. So the question is,
okay.
Palestine never existed as a country. What is the answer to that?
Palestine is yeah.
Okay. Well, most countries on the face of the earth didn't exist before World War II. There were no independent countries except Ethiopia in the entirety of Africa. There were no independent countries in the Middle East before World War I, except or immediately after World War I, except Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So most modern countries were established as a result of decolonization. What happened in Palestine is that instead of achieving their independence, the Palestinians were in effect colonized by the establishment of Israel. Israel didn't exist before 1948. So most modern countries, in fact, were established in the post-World War II era. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the United Nations Charter, which is the basis of the idea of self-determination in the modern world, doesn't say you have to have had a state before to have the right of self-determination. Every people, according to the UN Charter, has the right of self-determination. The Palestinians are a people. They have a right of self-determination. Israel didn't exist before 1948. Does that mean, that means that it shouldn't exist? You can turn that argument around, in other words. And that's true of most countries on the face of the earth. I mean, the Latin American countries and the European countries and a few others existed before World War II. All the rest of the world was under colonial rule. And of all of those peoples, the only ones who were not allowed to have their independence, among the only ones that were not allowed to have their independence, were the Palestinians.
Thank you very much. So Noor asked, one argument she always receives is, quote, Israelis never took Palestine from Palestinians, but took it from Jordan and Egypt. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. All you have to do is go back and read what Herzl himself or what Jabotinsky, one of the founders of Zionism and the person who's the sort of intellectual forebearer of Netanyahu and Shamir and Begin, what they wrote. They understood they were taking the country away from its indigenous population. The Palestinians are the indigenous population of Palestine. They were there before all of these European settlers came along with the idea of establishing a Jewish state. There were Jews in Palestine, but they had no idea of creating a Jewish state. They just wanted to live there, to worship, to be ordinary citizens. The idea of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine is a European idea, a result of European anti-Semitism. And the people who came along to take away Palestine from its indigenous inhabitants. I mean, I think, again, this is a case where doing a little bit of reading, reading this book of mine or reading other books would be very helpful, so as to understand how to deconstruct that ridiculous argument.
So hopefully when we have that reading list, we can share that with everybody. So Summer asks, what was
Start
the most
with the 100
difficult
Years'
part
War,
about
Anya.
writing this particular?
Say again? Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
I apologize. So I was saying that Summer was saying, what was the most difficult part about writing this particular book?
The hardest thing for me was to write in the first person and to include my own personal experiences and to put my family into the middle of the narrative. You know, I'd been trained since I was an undergraduate in writing history papers, and then later writing my dissertation and writing books, that you're supposed to write in the third person. You're supposed to take an objective, stance outside of the topic you're writing about. You're supposed to rigorously exclude your personality, yourself, your first person, from the way in which you write. So it was really, really hard to change the way I had written for many decades, and 7, 8, whatever it is, other books, and maybe 100, academic articles, and write this kind of book, which includes a lot of analysis and a lot of history, but is also in many respects personal. That was really hard for me.
So Serene is a master's architecture student who is starting her thesis in the fall, and her topic is rethinking refugee camps in the Middle East. She would like your opinion on the refugee camps currently there and whether they should be seen as a short-term solution or a long-term solution for the displaced populace.
Okay, well, I'm not an architect, so I mean, I can't comment on the architectural aspect of the question. But as far as the refugee camps, the population in these camps has been there for over 2 generations now. And so even though every Palestinian believes and has the right, believes that they hope to be able to return, and they have that right legally, internationally, in terms of international law, they have been there for a very long time, and they may be there for a while. So I think they have to be seen as communities which started off as something temporary, but which are going to continue for some time at least. And there are also maybe some Palestinians who will decide, even after Palestine is free, even after they have the opportunity to return, that they might not want to do so. People who are settled in other countries, maybe not refugee camp populations, but other Palestinians. But I think that improving the conditions of the population in those camps is in no way contrary to their international rights to return and to be compensated for what they've lost. It simply enables them to live a better life while they strive to liberate their homeland, while they strive to return to their homeland. So yeah, I mean, if you've ever experienced what some of these camps are like, they are large communities that are very well established. I mean, I know best the camps in Lebanon, where I lived for more than 20 years. They started as something temporary, but the people living in them are often in the 3rd generation of living in the same refugee camps. And they, at the very least, deserve a better life where they are until they're able to change that situation, until that situation changes.
So Rasha says, thank you for this lecture, Professor Khalidi, and she thanks you for shouting out Barnard. Her question is, how do we reconcile distinctions in different end goals in terms of activism for Palestine, i.e. 2-state versus 1-state?
Okay, I actually have, I mean, again, I hate to keep referring you to the book, and don't buy the book if you don't want to, but I make an argument in the book that this argument about 1 state, 2 states is a little bit of a diversion. First of all, because how we would get to 2 states, or how we would get to a just and equitable 1 state, is a very complicated question. It's not easy. How do you change a situation where Israel has done everything possible for 50 what is it now, 3 years to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state? How do you undo the colonization of 650,000 Israelis in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem? How do you undo the linking up of the occupied territories to Israel, the separation of the Palestinians in order to create a independent Palestinian state on the one hand, and how do you transform an unjust, discriminatory system in which Jews are privileged into a single state reality in which both peoples have equal rights? Both are very difficult. I think you start from principles. I argue in the book that you start from the principle of justice and equality. Whatever outcome we work towards has to be one which enshrines absolute equality of individuals and peoples and groups and the principle of justice. I think that spending too much time arguing one state, two state is really a diversion. I respect anybody who wants to argue for two states. I respect anybody who wants to argue for one state. I think we have a one state reality. Israel has created a one state reality. That is an Israeli state dominated by Jews, in which only Jews have the right of national self-determination. And that's not just an opinion. That is Israeli constitutional law by the Israel nation state law, the Jewish people nation state law of July 2018. That's now the law of the land in Israel. That's the constitution. In the land of Israel, there's room for one people, the Jewish people, with a right of self-determination. That's what they've mandated as constitutional law. You have to that would have to be transformed into something else, but that is the reality today. One people has the right of national self-determination in historic Palestine, between the river and the sea. So you can argue for transforming that into two states. You can argue for transforming that into an equitable one state in which the Palestinian people and the Israelis have national and individual and other rights. But I think that the basis of that, it has to be a principle of justice and equality. And I would argue that that's the way to proceed. And that's the way to argue in the context of a liberal democracy, where those are the basic principles of equality of every citizen. Why does this citizen have the right to bring her or his relatives from the Ukraine or from Los Angeles, and this citizen doesn't have the right to bring his or her relatives from Wahdat camp or from Miami? Why is this citizen more equal than that citizen? Why does this citizen have rights to this budget for education and that citizen not? So I would argue that those principles of justice and equality are the way to dismantle this discriminatory racist structure that's been established. Now, where you're going towards, I would argue, it's up to the Palestinians, first of all. It's not up to me or the 90 or 70 or whatever people are on this Zoom call. It's up to the Palestinian people to decide what objective they want. And at some stage, when the PLO did represent the Palestinians, when it was an active body, it argued for two states. I think it's time maybe for another chance to argue this and debate this and decide for the Palestinian people what they want. And I think that that's not the debate that we should be, dividing up over. I think that we have an enemy that doesn't want to allow the Palestinians to have any rights and any measure of justice, any kind of equality, and we should be arguing for those things.
Absolutely. So Dr. Abdul Hamid says, hello, Professor Rashid. This is Abdul Hamid Siam. Congratulations for the great book.
Thank you.
His question is, Professor, where do we go from here? We are facing an existential threat after the bargain of the century, the Palestinian division, and the Arab newfound alliance with Israel. What can be done now?
Okay, let me deconstruct that threat, because I think it's not as menacing as it appears. I don't think that what the Trump administration has done is going to last. And I don't say that just because I think the Trump administration is falling apart before our eyes in the face of the existential threat to the United States posed by this disease. I say that because it has the support of a minority. The Republicans have a majority in the Senate because the Senate is an essentially undemocratic body. They won an election in 2016, a presidential election, with 3 million less votes than the Democrats. That will change sooner or later. And when it changes, what the Trump administration has done is going to disappear like an iceberg in the sun. Secondly, it's not the Arabs who are allied with Israel. It's undemocratic, illegitimate Arab rulers who do not represent their people and who are more afraid of their people than they are of anything else and are completely dependent on external support, mainly from the United States, who are allied with Israel. Now, that's not going to change very quickly either. The Arab governments are very well entrenched, they're authoritarian, they repress their peoples, but there is a powerful democratic trend all over the Arab world. You've seen it in 2011 during the so-called Arab Spring, and you see it in Algeria, you see it in Sudan, you see it in Lebanon, you see it in Iraq, in the demonstrations that took place before this disease hit. Sooner or later, first of all, the Arab people, if you look at the polls, continue to support the Palestinians. So it's not the Arabs. It's a bunch of people who don't represent the Arabs. They represent their bank accounts. They represent their homes in Marbella. They represent the stealing of the wealth of the Arab people by these unrepresentative elites. So I don't think we should say the Arabs are allied with Israel. A bunch of illegitimate, unrepresentative rulers who are stealing the wealth of their people are allied with Israel. And sooner or later, that will change. There's been democratic change in almost every part of the world except the Arab world in the last couple of decades. Eastern Europe had communist regimes. Latin America had military dictatorships. South Asia, East Asia, Africa. In all of those areas, there's been change for the better in terms of greater democracy. That's not happened in the Arab world. Sooner or later, it will happen. So there's much reason to be pessimistic in the short run. But I think we should look at that larger picture and understand that people in the Arab world, even though they're being distracted by many things, even though they have many other problems, are still basically supportive of the Palestinians. And as to what we should do, well, I think we should continue to struggle for justice and equality. And I think actually we're doing much better in the United States and in Europe than we've ever done in our entire history. If you look at the 30s, the 20s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s even, when the PLO did a really reasonably good job of representing the Palestinians, and the 70s. Even then, I think we're doing a better job in many respects. And this, in spite of the absence of a powerful Palestinian national movement. Our national movement is in terrible shape right now. We all know that.
So thank you very much. So Smini says, thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you, what is your stand on the role that smaller countries such as Chile and other Latin American countries that have a considerable population of Palestinians can have in the international arena in supporting and changing the narrative of the Palestinian cause and rights? Is there any chance of them being important actors?
You know, a lot depends on the Palestinian communities in those countries. My son lives in Chile. And I've been there several times. And there's a really large, very influential Palestinian community in Chile. And I think a lot depends on our ability to mobilize and coordinate and organize together as Palestinians with Palestinians in these countries. There are a lot of Palestinians in many other Central American and Latin American countries. And many Arabs, Arab Brazilians and Arab Argentinians of Lebanese or Syrian or other origins who are sympathetic to the Palestine cause. And I think one thing we're lacking is the kind of unified diplomatic strategy that the PLO once had in the 60s and the 70s, and that right now the Palestinian National Movement just doesn't have. But I think that those countries could play a really important role. For one thing, because I think that the United States is a declining power, and it's not going to decline tomorrow. It's not going to decline in the 2020s or maybe even the 2030s. But this is an increasingly multipolar world. And small coalitions of states and coalitions of bigger states can actually have more impact, I think, over time. And active diplomacy and a good information effort and an effort to organize Palestinian Americans or Palestinian Chileans or Palestinian Brazilians or whatever it may be, I think could have an enormous impact.
Thank you. So Sada's question is next. She says, your book really enlightened me. I truly appreciate you stating the facts and giving us a glimpse of the true history behind the Palestinian struggle. You mentioned that the Palestinians finally realized what was happening in 1936, and that's when the riots began. Prior to that, when Sharif Hussein wanted to rule an Arab region, could the Arabs done anything differently to prevent British Zionist invasion?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a big question. it also involves a counterfactual. In other words, you're going to ask me to say what should have or could have happened in history. Yeah, different things could and maybe should have happened. One thing that you notice, if you look at the immediate post-war era, is that those Arab peoples who rose up against the British, or those peoples in the Middle East who resisted the European powers, the Iranians, the Turks, in the first instance, ended up with a much greater measure of independence than did the peoples who rose up later. This is true even in the Arab countries. If you look at Egypt, where there was a nationwide uprising in 1919, or Iraq, where there was a nationwide uprising against the British in 1920, or Syria, where there was a nationwide uprising in 1925, they all managed to win a greater measure of independence from the European powers the sooner after World War I that they rose up. The Palestinians' misfortune was to have their great rising 18 years after World War I, when the British were well entrenched and it was much harder to force them to change their policy. So, I mean, this is a might have been of history. Had the Arabs acted with more cohesion earlier on, yeah, they might have ended up with a better deal, and the Palestinians might have ended up with a better deal. I talk about a couple of the other might have beens of history in the book, but I don't think that's the best way to look at this. I mean, this is what happened is what happened, and it happened for the reasons that we, can figure out. The question is, can we learn from those lessons and go forward in the present and into the future?
Thank you very much. And just so everybody knows, it is 7:10. We're planning on going till 7:30. You guys have been amazing with the questions. So we're going to try to get to as many as we can. So Zaid asked, you have mentioned that there are 3 realistic outcomes of settler colonialism. What do you think is a realistic outcome of the settler colonialism of Palestine, and how do we unite Palestinians in the Arab League around a unified message?
Okay, those are two good questions. Let me answer the first one. I don't think that the outcome that occurred in Algeria is likely in Palestine. I don't think that these are settlers who are going to go back to their home country, because they actually don't have a home country. Most Israelis are born in Palestine. Most Israelis, certainly most Israeli, Ashkenazi Israelis, European Israelis of European origin, come from countries where the Holocaust occurred. Poland, Germany, Austria, other parts of Western Europe, other parts of Eastern Europe. They're not going to go back to those countries. There's just no chance of that. Maybe a few individuals might, but that's just not going to happen. In addition to which, Israel is a nuclear superpower. You're not going to see a Salah ad-Din come along and defeat Israel. That's not going to happen militarily. It is not going to happen. Anybody who thinks it's going to happen is actually sadly mistaken. But Israel has profound weaknesses, one of which is its dependence on the outside world, and in particular, its dependence on liberal democracies, where it is an illiberal, discriminatory country, which rules over a population, most of which doesn't have democratic rights. A majority of the population of Palestine are Arabs. And most of those people don't have any rights at all. The population of the West Bank, the population of the Gaza Strip, the population of Arab East Jerusalem have absolutely no national or political rights. They can't vote in an election which determines whether the checkpoints are removed, whether you can come in and go out, whether you control your own population register, whether you can actually drill a well and get water underneath your own village. None of those things are under the control of the Palestinian people. They're under the control of the Israeli government. So Israel is dependent on support of liberal democracies where it is not a liberal democracy. That is a huge vulnerability. It's something that they disguised for decades, but increasingly people are realizing that. So I would say that's a vulnerability that can be exploited, and that's one reason that I think the outcome you're more likely to see, may take a very long time, is an outcome more like the South African one. It's possible that there will be other outcomes. Another outcome would be the complete expulsion of all Palestinians. I don't think that's very likely. And I certainly don't think we're going to see the expulsion of the Israelis. So sooner or later, Israel is going to be obliged to come to terms with the fact that it's going to have to change fundamentally. It cannot remain a state premised on Jewish supremacy. That's simply not possible. It will have to come to terms with the fact that it's dependent on liberal democracies, and you're going to have an outcome which involves equality and justice. Now, how we get there, I don't know. I'm a historian. I can tell you about the past and how we got to the present. But I can also tell you that what is working today in 2020 in terms of reaching people is an argument on this basis.
So the next question is Iman's question, which is, what is the best narrative to start with a talk about Palestine with Americans in the world?
I would argue very much the one that I've tried to sort of lay out for you. First of all, the Palestinians are the indigenous population. They were denied self-determination. There has to be an outcome that's based on justice and equality. And what we have now is inherently discriminatory. One group of people has all control over the entirety of the country. Another group of people has absolutely no control over anything. That's, say, the Palestinians. And this is not a temporary situation. This has been going on since 1948, and in some respects, it's been going on since 1967. That's 2.5 generations since the occupation of 1967. That's more than 3 generations since the Nakba of 1948. So this is a situation that's intolerable. This is a situation that has to be changed, and it has to be changed in terms of justice and equality. That's the kind of argument I would make myself.
So Isra had a comment about the book list. She said it would be great if you could include books by contradictory resources, i.e. Israeli authors, so that as readers we can practice refuting arguments. Thanks so much, Professor.
The list that I will give you does include many books by Israeli authors, including some that are Zionists and that I would disagree with. But I am not including completely tendentious and books that are completely full of falsehoods. I mean, there's a ton of those. If you want, write me. Isra, is that Isra who asked the question? Write me and I can give you a couple of those books. But I mean, the shelves of libraries are full of that kind of stuff. And you know, much of it is in popular culture rather than in academic books. In books like Exodus by Leon Uris, which has actually had much more of an effect on public opinion than a lot of scholarly books.
So Shadi asks, in the Iron Cage book, you put the case of a two-state solution being a more reasonable and practical approach to be taken by the Palestinians than that of the one-state approach. I was hoping you can expand on that in the light of recent changes, the deal of the century being among them.
I don't think I really argue in favor of a two-state solution in the Iron Cage. I was never a very enthusiastic supporter of a two-state solution. I mean, I see the arguments for it. Palestinians want to have self-determination; they have that right. But when I wrote the Iron Cage, I was pretty much convinced of the almost impossibility of achieving a two-state solution. So I myself don't believe that this argument is one worth having among people who support Palestinian rights. I think that the key thing is to get to an outcome that involves justice and equality. I think a one-state solution is more likely to do that. But I have to admit, anybody who argues for a one-state solution has the obligation to try and lay out how you get from the one-state solution we have today, which is an unjust, unequal, Israeli-dominated one-state solution, to a one-state solution where there's dignity, where there's equality, and where there's justice. And I'm not sure how we get to that. I certainly don't see how we could get to a two-state solution. Israel has worked tirelessly for 53 years to make a two-state solution impossible. It might have been possible in the 60s or the 70s. I'm not sure I can see how it would be possible today. But I don't see my way clear to arguing how you get to a just, equitable one-state solution either. We have a lot of work to do.
That we definitely do. Paolo asks, what do you think of the idea that annexation of the occupied territories could eventually lead to a one-state solution with equal rights for all, like in Ireland?
You know, I think the Irish example is a very important one that Palestinians haven't looked at carefully enough. My next project is actually going to be a comparison of Ireland and Palestine. It's going to be along the lines of Ireland and Palestine, Britain's first and last settler colonies, something like that. So it'll be partly historical and it'll partly be an attempt to look at Ireland, because Ireland has a lot of similarities to Palestine, and it's very different in many respects. So to answer your question, I actually think the annexation of the occupied territories will work in the direction you're talking about. As the Israelis complete what they started in 1948 and then continue with what they started doing in 1967, it makes the argument for equal rights within a single state just a much stronger argument, I think. And a lot of Zionists see that, and they're very, very worried about the implications of annexation. But I think they're moving towards it, and I think we should be planning for it. What does that mean? How does that strengthen our case?
Thank you. So Firas said, thank you so much, Dr. Khalidi, for the insightful lecture. I'd like to ask about the birthright trip that all people with any sort of Jewish heritage are granted a trip to Palestine. Some American Jews that I know, they're not knowing anything about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and most, when they come back, are completely brainwashed. With that said, how do we combat this brainwashing?
Well, that's a hard question. And the first thing is that what we should be doing is to encourage people to go on a Palestine birthright trip. The second thing we should be doing is to encourage other Americans to go on a trip where they actually see Palestine and are not just brainwashed. What you do about the brainwashing of students and young people by the Israelis, it's a very difficult question. I mean, the people who put this together have sort of created an insulated bubble where, to as large an extent as they're capable of guaranteeing, they see nothing and hear nothing. The challenge is the false narrative that they're being fed. I'm not sure what you do about it. You just have to argue to people who are even more convinced of a series of falsehoods that what they were shown was not the whole picture. Sending people to see Palestine, other Americans, I think is really important. At schools of public policy, at law schools, at business schools, there are fully paid trips to Israel, sponsored by the Israeli government indirectly. What they do is they get donors to do it, but it's organized by the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel. And what has been happening, at least on my campus, at Harvard, at a few other universities, is that public policy schools, law schools, and business schools are organizing trips to Palestine. So the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia, the law school at Columbia, has had bigger and bigger trips. And most of the people going are not Palestinians or Arabs or Muslim Americans. They're just ordinary, Americans. And it has a wonderful effect.
So on that note, I'm going to plug in PAC's very own Homeland Project, where we actually do send Arab Americans to Palestine for a 10-day journey.
Right.
And we give you the whole cultural, educational experience. Actually, Firas applied for this project this year, so I'm hoping he'll be able to go. And so we encourage you all to kind of check it out on our website, www.paccusa.org, and I'll put it in the chat, the exact link to the application. So next question is Lubnaz. She's asking, what are your thoughts about Oslo?
Oslo is terrible agreement, mistakenly entered into by the PLO leadership. I have a whole chapter on Oslo. I was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation at Madrid and at Washington. Behind our backs, they went off to Oslo and did the Oslo Accords. And we learned a great deal in negotiating in Washington with the Israelis. And every lesson that we learned was ignored by the people who went to Oslo. They fell into every trap that we avoided. They made every possible mistake. And we're living with the results of that disaster. Edward Said, Allah yarhamu, described it as a Palestinian Versailles, meaning the peace treaty that was imposed on Germany at the end of World War I. This was not just imposed on the Palestinians. Unfortunately, the PLO leadership voluntarily entered into it. It was one of their worst mistakes, in my view. It's an agreement which it was completely unequal. By this agreement, the Palestinian people recognized the state of Israel. Israel did not recognize a Palestinian right of self-determination or a Palestinian state. In fact, Israel did nothing. Let me put it differently. In fact, Israel was enabled to do things that were meant to prevent a Palestinian state. The continued expansion of the settlements, the continued closure of Jerusalem, continued control over most of the occupied territories, all of this indefinite, without any indication of when it would end, and without any guarantee that the end result would be a Palestinian state and Palestinian self-determination. It was a terrible, terrible agreement, and it was a terrible thing that they signed it.
So the next question is from Janine. She says, even beyond the facts, there are people who do not even view Palestinians as humans. How do we get people to see the humanity of Palestine and Palestinians? This goes beyond the Western world. I would argue even some Arab countries are guilty of this too, especially in today's politics.
The questioner, what's the name? What's the name of the person who asked the question?
Janine.
Janine is completely right. I mean, this is an issue that goes beyond facts, and it is really true. And I would argue that the best way to show the Palestinians are human is through art and culture. Palestinian cinema, Palestinian theater, Palestinian plays, novels, poetry, art are indications that this is a real people, that it you know, it has ordinary life. People have ordinary lives like other people. And that's really the best way to reach people, in my view, insofar as showing that the Palestinians are human beings like everybody else. But you're right, there is a part of the effort that's ongoing against the Palestinians is to dehumanize them, to erase them from history, but to dehumanize them. And this is what colonialism does everywhere. It's what they did to the Native Americans. It was what was done in South Africa. It was what was done in Algeria. It's done in every colonial settler, in every colonial situation, in every situation where a people is subjugated by another people. They're always dehumanized.
So the next question is from Ghalib. Ahad Haim, considered the founding father of cultural Zionism, provided an alternative to Herzl's territorial Zionism. Do you see a potential shift back to cultural Zionism, or will territorial Zionism continue to be prevalent ideology, especially given the depth and support of Christian Zionist evangelicals to settler ideology?
You know, that's a question I'm going to dodge, and I'm going to give my classic excuse. The job description of a historian doesn't include predicting the future. I have no idea whether it's a good question. And cultural Zionism was a force. Ahad Ha'am and other people, Gershom Shalom, a number of other leading Zionists, were not territorial Zionists. They didn't believe in statehood and territorial sovereignty. They just believed in reconstituting the Jewish people as a national entity. But they didn't believe in all of the things that came with territorial Zionism, like ethnic cleansing and systematic racism. But whether that can return or not, I really don't know. I think there are a number of people now who are moving away from Zionism. And it's really been quite surprising to me to see how many Israeli, but especially also American and European Jewish intellectuals are seeing some of the fundamental problems. Not just with Zionism as an ideology, but what Zionism in practice necessarily amounts to. Whether that leads to territorial or Zionism or another kind of spiritual or others, I couldn't say.
So I just want to make a point. There were some people who asked two questions. I tried to keep it to one question because it is 7:26 and we're running out of time.
4 minutes, guys.
Yes, 4 minutes. I think this may be the last question. So Mukbil asks, using the word war is something I don't see applicable. Usually wars are between two separate nation armies. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been an aggression against the Palestinians rather than a war. Why not use the word aggression rather than war as the title of the book?
Well, because I actually think it has been a war. What we went through in Beirut in 1982 was a war. What the Palestinians went through from 1936 to 1939 was a war. The British brought in 2 divisions of troops in the Royal Air Force, armor and artillery. That was a war. What's going on, has been going on in Gaza for the last 5 or 6 years is a war. Israel is making war on the Palestinians. It's an aggression as well. But I actually think that the term war is applicable. Anyway, read the book. You may disagree with me.
So the other point is from Seema. She says, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Dr. Khalidi. This is a very special opportunity. You mentioned earlier that young American Jews are increasingly denouncing Israeli oppression against Palestinians. Do you have any thoughts of Jewish youth in Israel? Have you noticed any divides in attitudes between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jewish youth?
Actually, the change has been much greater in the United States, in the American Jewish community, I think, than it has been in Israel. It's very depressing to say that, but it's true. Most young Israelis seem to be as brainwashed as their elders, and that's much less true in the United States. It's true of some, but it's much less true in the United States. There are trends. The idea of the Arab Jew, the idea among many Mizrahis, among many Israelis of Oriental origins, of Arab origins, or Iranian or Turkish origins, that they are indigenous to the region themselves, is a possible bridge. But many Mizrahis are very, very chauvinist, very racist, very anti-Arab. They support, right-wing parties in many cases. So I'm not sure that that trend will necessarily increase or become more important, but it's possible that it will. And I also think that as external support is brought into question, Israelis will change their views. It's happened in the past. Changes in American policy caused Israelis to change their views. And I think you might be surprised at how big a change might be possible when Israelis realize they can't get away with what they're getting away with in terms of external support. And that means we have to make that change take place in the United States and in Europe, which are still the metropole for this settler colony. Israel is an independent state. Israel is a nuclear power. Israel is a very strong country. Israel has a lot of latitude to do what it wants, but it is dependent on the United States and Europe. Most of its trade is with Europe. Its diplomatic support and much of its arms come from the United States. The capital that makes this whole thing work mainly comes from the United States, not just in terms of billions of dollars in American military aid, the billions of dollars in money that's given to Israel as a 501c3 tax-deductible charity. So Friends of the Israel Defense Forces is a 501c3. Settlement, 501c3s that support settlements are another example. There's billions and billions of dollars. They depend on that external support. You take away the tax exemption, and they're in a completely different situation. You make aid to Israel conditional, they're in a completely different situation. And I think you'll see Israelis change their views very quickly if any of those things were to happen.
So it is 7:30, but I accidentally skipped one question. So if we can just end with this question. And I know there were many more. You guys, again, did amazing with the questions, and I apologize we couldn't get to all of them. So good evening, Dr. Khalidi. Yazid says, good evening, Dr. Khalidi. What do you believe is the proper course of action when it comes to holding Israel accountable for the various crimes that has committed, given the fact that international institutions are so limited in their power? Example, the problems of jurisdiction granting and the UNCS permanent member veto power when it comes to the ICJ, ICC, and other international courts and tribunals.
The key problem is the United States. It'll be very easy to get a large majority in the General Assembly, but as the questioner correctly points out, most power in the United Nations, as it was laid out in the UN Charter, is in the hands of the Security Council. And the obstacle there is not China or Russia or a majority of the Security Council, most of which votes in favor of resolutions that the United States then vetoes. Sometimes the British join them. But most of the time, the only obstruction to a more just outcome in the United Nations is the United States, which means it's incumbent on us to do what can be done to change American policy. And that's not an easy thing to do. Looking at the administration that's in office right now, looking at the Republican Party, somebody mentioned evangelicals and their blind support for Israel. All of those are factors, but there are other factors too. There are changes taking place in this country that are very positive, and I think that if we help to accelerate those changes, then you change the position of by far the most important country in the Security Council, which is the United States.
Thank you so much. And with that, I really sincerely want to thank you, Dr. Khalidi, for your time and for imparting such wonderful wisdom and knowledge on us all. I want to thank all our wonderful participants. I think we reached up to 95 participants, which is the most we've ever had on a webinar. So we're very indebted and happy to have you all with us. I'd like to remind you all that next week we have Noura Arikat joining us.
She's fabulous, guys. She's fabulous.
We're excited to be hosting her. We'll be hosting her next week at 5:30 on Monday. So please make sure to register. Please make sure to spread the word. And don't forget to visit our website, www.paccusa.org, for all our other events. And do not forget to take the census. We count. And thank you again, Dr. Khalidi. Have a wonderful day. I hope everybody stays safe and healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks very much, everybody.